another thing. See, if they would have had a microphone, then everybody could have heard them, right? Great questions. And you know, if they would have had iPhones and Google search, they would have got the, I mean, not the children, but if the question, right, where Herod has to go and ask other people about where all of this was happening, if they would have had iPhones and Google search, they would have gotten the answer. So anyway, great question. And one important question is, why do you think Herod was afraid of what the Magi were asking about? Because if there's another king born, what does that mean about him as king, right? That there's a usurper to the throne, and so he's frightened that there's somebody who's going to dethrone him, send him off packing. And one thing to remember about the story is Herod was not really Jewish. He was married into a Jewish family and kind of was always under suspicion by the traditionalists and conservatives in the Jewish community of Jerusalem because of that. And so being of the tribe of Judah meant that the new king stood in the ancestry line of David and Solomon and on and on and on. So he would have more claim to the throne of Jerusalem than Herod. And so that's also why he's all upset and all afraid. So you're right, in the translations, depending upon where you look, is that it's either astrologers. I'm not sure when it comes to kings, because how would astrologers get hold of such rich gifts, right? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And they were indeed very, very scarce things, right? Average people didn't have gold. Frankincense is the sap of a tree only found in Arabia, and myrrh would be more like the oil. And so one of the questions, why those gifts, it's because as Matthew was telling the story, to recognize that Jesus, this tiny child, was indeed not just the new king, but had significance beyond anything anybody imagined at the time, that you just offer extravagant gifts to impress the audience that, wow, this baby is something special, and therefore the wealth of the gifts, or the value of the gifts, is exaggerated to emphasize that. So that's some of the background to it. And you're indeed right, as the children learned, right, is that these astrologers were the ones who watched the stars. I don't know how many remember, was it last year, the year before, that the scientists made this great, huge splash in the news that the conjunction of 3 planets was going to happen such that they thought that this is what the Star of Bethlehem would have looked like. Well, to be honest with you, I went out the night that it was supposed to be the best night, and I could barely find it in the sky. I don't know if anybody else did that. I even took a picture, and it's like, come on, give me a break. Really? If that's what would have led the Magi to Bethlehem, they would never have found their way. So that was not impressive at all. So that is like called into question for me, this whole story about this, because I always see the pictures, right, of this huge star with this pointed end down to Bethlehem. And no, I don't think that was it at all. So that kind of takes away, right? Science takes away a little bit of the mystery of the story. And that's what's unfortunate about it. But in any event, if we keep in mind that what's going on in the story at the surface level, right? Not only is this a wonderful story. Look, I mean, just waiting for the kings to show up. I don't know about you. In some households in that that it's almost, quote, a mortal sin to put the three kings out before the Feast of Epiphany. When you set up the nativity set, I just go, oh, forget it. Just put them all out at the same time. So it has lost a little bit of its edge and significance for that. But in any event, the point is for us to view the story and stand in awe and wonder of it. So that's one entry point into this story. Another entry point is to remember that Matthew's gospel is written to a Jewish Christian community, and probably in its origins was a more conservative and traditional Jewish community. That's why in the story, when Herod fearfully approaches the ones who were learned in the Torah, in the scripture, why they go in search of the Torah, because for Matthew's community, the only, quote, source of authority and truth was the Torah. And so if it's not in the Torah, then it's not true. Sounds sort of like our current discussion about what's true and what's not true. And depending upon what network you watch on TV, you either get the truth or you don't get the truth. But anyway, that's another story, right? So in the story, Matthew wants to make sure that his audience, the traditional conservative Jews, who find truth and authority only in the written Torah, that he can convince them about the next part of the story. And sure enough, they go back into the prophets, and there they find something that gives a hint at, or can be the connector for them, that the, quote, Messiah, or the newborn king of the Jews, and remember, this was a belief that develops after the time of the ending of exile, so that they can begin to believe the truth that this child born fulfills all of the promises that they've been listening to over generations and generations. So let me say it again, that this child fulfills all of the promises that they have held on to as their sole source of hope for generations. But it goes a little bit further than that. And here for Matthew's community, the struggle, unlike Luke's community, where we have the story of the shepherds. And remember, the reason I gave for why Luke tells the story with shepherds in it is because Luke comes from an upper class, well-educated community that is struggling with the poor and the marginal ones and the excluded ones. And so the best way to convince his community that they need to embrace and welcome in the people at the edges is to have smelly, dirty shepherds show up in their story. And they become the first ones, if you remember how Luke tells it, to get the good news. Well, how can you deny access and participation of those who get the good news first? You have to welcome them for Luke's purpose. For Matthew's purpose, the challenge is different. If the majority in the community are conservative and traditional Jews who only find truth in the Torah, you're going to have to find a way to help the community understand why they have to be welcoming in Gentiles. Why should we welcome non-Jews into our community? Because we know that truth only resides within our community. Is there truth outside of our community? Most certainly not. That's why we've got to go to the Torah to find the truth. Is there any possibility that truth exists outside of our community? In come the Magi. Where did the Magi come from? From the east. And if you're in Jerusalem, and you're there looking east, you're looking up and over the Mount of Olives, as it's called now, down to the Jordan River Valley, and there's the boundary line, geographical for one, the Jordan River Valley, but also philosophically, theologically, spiritually, ethnically. The minute you cross the Jordan, you're in Gentile territory. And for conservative, traditional Jews of the day, you didn't want to have anything to do with anybody from the other side of the tracks, so to speak. Remember how that some of us grew up in communities, right? If you came from the other side of the tracks, you were not accepted and welcome. It was like the scrubby Dutch or the lace curtain Irish compared to the shanty Irish growing up as I heard the stories. So for Matthew's community to have a story where Magi come and are the ones who, in the spirit of the word epiphany, or in the spirit of the word manifestation, are the ones who enter into the world of Matthew's community, bringing truth that explodes the narrowness and the sharp confines of their idea of truth. I thought God only worked in our world. You mean God might be working in somebody else's world? I just saw a story where who gathers these kinds of groups of people to study things, that they now have a group who is studying how they're going to let the rest of us in the world know that when life is discovered somewhere outside of Earth, that they will be able to prepare us for that reality. And I had to laugh because I posted on Facebook, hey, I've been watching Star Trek since I was a kid, and I already know that there's life on other planets, thanks to Star Trek, right? So this ain't going to come as a surprise to me that there's life on other planets. How could we possibly think that we exist as the only human life in the whole of this huge universe? Now you know Matthew's gospel today. How can we say Matthew's gospel is writing to his community? How can we ever imagine that God is so small to privilege only one community with the truth, when we know that God is much larger than this small community, and therefore truth exists in much greater ways beyond our ethnic, religious, social, economic community? That's really what the manifestation is. So that on one hand, the story tells us, and by the way, the inclusion of frankincense and myrrh in the story is Matthew's hint as to what's going to happen at the end of the story. Because Jesus' body is taken down off the cross, and part of the preparation for burial is to put the myrrh and put the frankincense, so that as the body decays, it's not going to be too smelly, but it will smell of frankincense and myrrh. So Matthew, like Luke, is already preparing us for the end of the story. That's why frankincense and myrrh are part of the gifts. So Matthew, this story is speaking to the traditional conservatives in the community, where they are now given beyond any question that Jesus is the fulfillment of all those promises made. It's indisputable now, according to that vision of things. But the bigger challenge, in my opinion, is, can we think outside of our small little box where we believe we possess all of the truth, and therefore anybody questioning our truth not only should be excluded, but if anybody presents a truth contrary to ours, it is to be rejected. And so Magi entering in, manifesting the truth that not only is God with us in our tradition in Torah, but God is with everybody who stands outside of us to offer truth for us. I've often thought, and you know how many stories, and this is to push it a little bit, how many of the great thinkers and writers and producers and the great statesmen came from immigrant communities. If it wasn't for them, the immigrant communities, not bracketing out a whole story about Native Americans and Native Americans who were here and we stole the property from them. Without the wisdom, the insight, the spirit, the motivation, the gung-ho, perseverance, and survival instinct of immigrants, where would we be? But you know that every immigration law in this country has been racist based. To either keep out the Chinese, to keep out the Irish, to enslave and oppress the African American. Why did it take so long? You know, it was not until the 1960s, that Native American peoples were recognized as full citizens of the United States. Unbelievable. So when public policy, and this is Herod's perspective, when public policy is threatened by authority that comes from outside, it can only act in one way: close the borders and to circle the wagons and restrict access to truth outside by way of controlling the press and the media, so to speak. And so in the story is embedded the double challenge of not only recognizing the fulfillment of promises, but also the manifestation that God's truth is bigger than us. And when we close in fear the boundaries, we actually keep out the larger truth and revelation and manifestation of God. Even Vatican II said this, and it always impressed me, because growing up, and I'll end with this, growing up in a Roman Catholic community, we thought we had the truth and we were the only true church that existed. And I always struggled with that because my father's side of the family was Missouri Synod Lutheran, and they had their own problems also about accepting and recognizing truth outside of their community. But I knew that my Lutheran relatives were just as good a Christians and faithful as the Roman Catholic family. So how could we ever think that we totally have the truth and others didn't? Of course, on the Lutheran side and many Protestant side, right? They were doing the same thing. You Catholics are the ones who don't have the truth. We do. Sort of like a football record, right? We got the truth and you don't, and you argue back and forth. The invitation in 2022, finally, is to not only see Jesus as the fulfillment of promises. That's the faith, theology, and spirituality. But also to know that in our guts, when we close off the possibility of discovery, having it manifested for us that God exists in a much larger way, maybe in Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist communities, maybe in atheist and agnostic communities, that God's revelation and manifestation might come to us by the way that we embrace and welcome those who are outside of our boundaries, and to welcome and invite them in to share their wisdom and their truth with us.